Welcome to the Muslim Faculty of Advanced Studies Online. For more information about our programs, publications and membership, please visit our website, themuslimfaculty.org.
Assalamu alaikum. The purpose of the following lecture, entitled Discourses of the Secular, is not to cover the full spectrum of secular ideas and realities in the modern age, nor is it to make pronouncements about the virtues or vices about secular societies. Rather, it is an introduction to some perspectives that might help us to understand how the secular, in its various discourses, defines our way of thinking and acting in the modern world. In order to make these perspectives comprehensible and useful, however, we will begin by defining our terms and clarifying the basic ideas. The classic thesis of secularization identifies three essential elements. Firstly, a structural differentiation of social spheres resulting in separation of religion from politics. Secondly, a privatization of religion. And thirdly, a decreasing social significance of religion. Many aspects of this thesis have been challenged by modern scholars, but although these debates are interesting, it's not our aim here to challenge the thesis itself, but our purpose is rather to discuss the idea of secularization, not only as a descriptive thesis, but as a normative idea that, or a discourse in fact, that shapes our lives in the modern society. A leading anthropologist of the secular, Talal Asad, suggests that secularism presupposes new concepts and imperatives of religion, ethics and politics, closely linked to the emergence of the capitalist nation-state. He argues that secularism functions as a political medium that redefines and transcends practices that are articulated through class, gender and religion. He concludes in his book Formations of the Secular that the secular cannot be viewed as a supposedly rational successor to religion, but rather must be seen as a historical category related to the major premises of modernity, democracy, and equality. And we will return later to these crucial key concepts in the formation of the secular, which in fact have been central to the formation of religion in the modern age. And as for the term discourse in the title, it refers to systems of thought, ideas and practices that systematically construct the subjects and the world of which they speak. Discourses are representations and producers of social knowledge, and thus closely connected to wider social relations of power. In this view, discourses are controlled by what can be spoken of, where and how one may speak, and who may speak. Because speech is connected to practice, it also impinges on what one might do, where and how one may do it, and who may do it. And therefore language and law, which is the core themes of our two presentations to follow, are intimately related. It defines what can be said and what can be done in certain contexts, which in turn defines what can or cannot be, and that is identity. And the point of these proposed definitions is to widen our thinking about the secular. And one useful way to understand the secular society is to understand its representations of religion, which is one of the counterpoints by which the secular societies define themselves. And in that respect, religion is an essential part of the secular, just as the secular is an essential part of the concept of religion as separate from worldly affairs. Although the formations differ depending on context, there are some agreed upon assumptions of the secular that shape political and social realities. For instance, we often find in secular societies that groups which do not fit into the constructed representations of the majority are defined and excluded as minorities. Usually religious, these groups are on the defensive, since minorities are defined as minorities only in hierarchical structures of power. And these representations then functions to define the majority identity itself, and they are then mediated through the discourses of secular society, whether it be via the law, media, education, and so forth. And because these dominant representations take the secular as a self-evident ideal, these concepts define the public discourses of its minorities by regulating what can be spoken of, where and how they can speak, and who may speak. Formation of identity, particularly in the modern age, is not only a matter of creating identifiable sameness in the original sense of the word, but also about representing identity in relation to others, that is, in front of others. And therefore, these discursive representations are crucial to all narratives of all individuals and groups in society. And in relation to our title, Identity in Time, I suggest that formations of identities are also closely connected to time. One reason for the difficulties of Muslim representation in the secular discourses of Europe is that the temporality of Islam's tradition-rooted practices and worldviews cannot be translated into the homogeneous time of, that is, secular time of national politics. The narrative life transaction of Islam naturally escapes the instrumental orientation of modern politics, in the same way as the integrated worldview of Islam, encompassing both spiritual and worldly realities, escape the secular concept of religion. And I suggest that the main point of preoccupation for us is that the dominant discourses are not deterministic facts. They're constantly in change. And therefore, an understanding of their structures or modes of influence is necessary in order to effectively negotiate our own identity and indeed a way of life in this time and place. To understand the impact of the secular, however, we need some examples that can shed light on how secular ideas of religion affect the way Muslims view their own traditions. The negative representations of Islam in many dominant public discourses are not only values against which the secular society defines itself, but values that leave Muslims with two options: either adopt modern values and become moderate Muslims, or to confirm the negative representations of Muslims by defending its premises and become extremists. The symbolic issue of women is one example. Moderate Muslims are those who reject the image of inequality by adopting modern European values, while extremist Muslims are those who oppose the modern concept of equality by actually defending what the secularists define as unequal and oppressive. Both responses are, however, closely connected to the discourses of the secular dominion, which thereby not only form secular perceptions of Islam, but actual practices and identities among Muslims. Another, perhaps surprising example was occasioned last year when, with the publication of an article by Dr. Yassine Dutton on the various readings of the Quran. The article discussed the different recitations and related the views of traditional Muslim scholars to contemporary research about oral traditions. In the past, European Orientalists have held that the absence of one uniform reading would cast doubt on the authenticity of the Quranic revelation. But what Dutton challenges in his article is in fact the secular representation of religion as static, uniform, and irrational, by showing the sophisticated reasoning of classic Muslim scholars. In line with the Orientalists, however, some Muslims, reflecting the secular paradigm, have also given primacy to the idea of uniformity of reading, and thus redefine the traditional understanding according to secular concepts of religion. And the same tendencies are found among those attempting to make Islam a uniform religion in the secular sense by allowing for only one way of praying, one way of reciting them, and one way of behaving. These modern interpretations confirm the secular concept of religion by word and deed, which in turn reflects a shared discursive foundation. Another aspect of religion in the secular definition is that it only concerns, or at least should only concern, individual morality and theology, which is, in the secular discourse, static and irrational beliefs. When Islam is represented as a religion, it is inevitably disconnected from its political, economic, and historical realities. When Muslims adopt the defensive position of a religious minority, they are allowed to retain their religious identity, while any attempts at representing the other aspect of Islam fail to translate into secular politics. A Muslim being more than religious in the moderate sense is designated within the dominant discourse as threatening, or in the worst case is reduced to basic human status, that is, devoid of citizenship and thereby devoid of human rights. As Talal Asad notes, which is worth remembering in relation to the contemporary politics of terror, he says, "A secular state does not guarantee toleration. It puts into play different structures of ambition and fear. The law never seeks to eliminate violence, since its object is always to regulate violence." And again, discourse is more than speech. It determines both worldview and practice. One only has to reflect, for instance, on the topographical semiotics of the wall in Palestine, on the architectural semiotics of modern schools or financial institutions, the procedural semiotics of electoral democracy, or the commercial semiotics of supermarkets, or perhaps the legal semiotics of the right to free speech and religious freedom. How does it impinge on the behavior and worldviews of people interacting within these societies? It might have been useful to conclude with some examples of new Muslim discourses within secular societies that have managed to go beyond the secular structures and actually represented Islam for what it is, or traditionally have been to Muslims themselves. Recent initiatives towards tajdeed, that is, renewal in scholarship, politics, economics, media, social work, and so forth, are all worth mentioning. But since the point of this presentations and the presentations to follow is to provide ready fuel for the symposium, it is more appropriate that I restrict myself to merely indicating what may be fruitful avenues for further exploration together regarding these questions of Muslim identities and ways of life within, or perhaps beyond, the boundaries of the secular. Assalamu alaikum.